Hey everybody, my name is Michelle. I am a mental health therapist in the Seattle, Washington area. If you're new to my YouTube channel, the name of my practice is Next Chapter Counseling. And I'm going to be answering the question today that came from someone who asked me, does the honeymoon phase have to end in a relationship? Basically, is it inevitable that all relationships get to this place where things just kind of feel routine and boring, or can you keep the honeymoon phase going? So I thought this was a great question, and I'm going to go through a couple things today as I'm answering it. The first thing I think that is important to address is, what is the honeymoon phase? What are we talking about here? So that's a common term that's tossed around, and most people, I would say, have a pretty good idea of what that means. However, I think it's really important to define it. So the honeymoon phase is typically the early stage, like the first stage of a relationship when two people are falling in love with each other. The sparks are starting to fly. They're maybe newly in their relationship, and there's a lot of attraction and chemistry between them. They're falling for each other, is basically what's going on in the honeymoon phase. There's actually been a lot of research done on this. What is this honeymoon phase and how long does it last for? So research has actually shown that the honeymoon phase can last up to 2 years in a relationship. That's typically the longest it's shown to stick around. And the way that research has measured this is basically by more or less hooking people up to various like scanners and brain things, which I don't know the technical terms for, and kind of seeing what parts of the brain are firing when we're in this phase of falling in love, when it's early in a relationship. What's going on in our brains that makes it different than, say, a couple that's been together for 20 years, and what's going on in their brains? And pretty much what they've shown is that when we're in this honeymoon phase, certain parts of our brain are lighting up, certain chemicals are being released, and that our brain can more or less release those chemicals and experience the high that we sometimes feel of falling in love for up to 2 years. And then after that, our brain has more or less kind of adjusted to this person, adjusted to this relationship. Chances are you've probably had a disagreement or two by that time, and our brains are starting to process things differently. So 2 years is the mark that research has shown. And I think that's interesting because if you think about it, a lot of relationships end around the 2-year mark. That's a common time for relationships to end. And if you also think about culturally what is expected of relationships, a lot of times after you've been with someone for around 2 years, it's pretty much expected, at least here in the United States, that you are taking a step forward in your relationship. You are getting engaged, you are moving in together. If it hasn't happened by that point, it's kind of expected around the 2-year mark that something is going to go somewhere. And I think all of that can kind of collide, the expectations of society, what is going on neurochemically in your brain, and it can collide to create this stage where the honeymoon ends and therefore the relationship ends. So that's what we're talking about with the honeymoon phase here. So it may seem like I've already given you the answer to the question, which may sound like a yes, the honeymoon has to end. And for the most part, I would say that is the answer to the question here. Based off of what science shows us, is that inevitably a relationship will transition from the falling in love phase to a different kind of love, to a more mature kind of love, one could say. Some people will argue that the honeymoon phase ends when you move in together because then you learn a lot about each other. You're around the other person more often. If you don't have pet peeves with them yet, you probably will once you live together. Some people argue the honeymoon phase ends when you get married or when you have kids. Whenever a big life change happens, your relationship is going to make a change along with that. And again, inevitably, as you spend more time with this person, get more comfortable with them, see more of their flaws, you're going to feel differently towards them than you did in those early butterfly times of the relationship. So that's one way to look at it, is that yes, the honeymoon phase ends. Eventually your love will change and hopefully grow in really positive ways, but it won't feel like the honeymoon anymore. It'll feel like something else. So that's one answer there, I guess you could say. The other way to look at this, though, is that even if science shows us that after 2 years in a relationship with someone, your love is going to make a transition into a different stage than it does in the honeymoon stage. To me, the other way to look at this is that your love does not have to get boring or dull or anything like that. It doesn't just have to be this death sentence of, okay, the first 2 years of our relationship are going to be the best, and then after that, well, it's all downhill, and there's nothing we can do. We're going to get more and more frustrated with each other, and things are going to get more and more difficult. It doesn't mean that. There are thousands of ways, figure it out between you and your partner, but there's tons of ways out there to keep the spark alive between the two of you, to have your love feel young and joyful and playful. There's all sorts of ways that you can keep that present in your relationship, whether you've been together 3 months or whether you've been together 30 years. You can find ways to keep the excitement going. The honeymoon phase ending does not spell death for the relationship, even though, like I said, a lot of relationships do die at that point. They don't make it past that 2-year mark to see what's on the other side. But once you have made it to the other side, redefine the rules of what you think a relationship of your relationship's length is supposed to look like. If you have it in your mind that, like, oh, well, after 25 years, this is what a relationship is bound to look like, forget about that. You can make your relationship whatever you want it to be, and you can find ways with your partner to keep your relationship feeling fresh and new and interesting like it did in the honeymoon phase. It just takes a little more intentional effort, again, especially as life changes happen, if kids get thrown into the mix. This is why people say relationships take work, because it does take some effort to keep a relationship feeling fresh and new and interesting like it did in the beginning, but it can absolutely be done. So I don't know. Take my answers for what it's worth, but I can see a strong argument for saying yes, the honeymoon phase does end. But there's also this other argument that I'll put forth of only if you let your relationship get stagnant, which you do not have to do. You can make efforts with your partner to keep things feeling new at any point in your relationship, no matter how long you've been together. So hopefully that helps or gives you some food for thought at least. The answer is basically yes and no at the same time for does the honeymoon phase have to end. So if you have a question for me about love or relationships, email it to me. nextchapter.michelle@gmail.com. Thanks. I'll see you guys soon.